it's the most wonderful time of the year. Or is it? While families across the world settle in for cozy nights by the tree, there are some homes where the warmth of the season is pierced by a chill of something darker lurking in the shadows. Imagine waking up to find your Christmas gifts untouched, but a plate of cookies mysteriously empty, and your child swears they saw Santa, but not the way you thought. A man, gaunt and wild-eyed, sneaking around your home as you slept, his presence unnoticed, until it's almost too late. What if the holiday magic was hiding something much more sinister, something you never expected to find? Stay with us as we dive into this chilling, true Christmas horror stories, and keep listening if you dare. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. Christmas in our home is much like anyone else's, I think. Every year, my wife and I tell our son the same familiar story. How Santa sneaks in with gifts on Christmas Eve, and by morning, there they are under the tree, creating that magic and wonder we all love. This year, our 6-year-old was especially excited to leave out cookies and milk for Santa. So, before tucking him into bed, we made sure to set out a plate of cookies and a cup of milk. After a few minutes of waiting to ensure he was asleep, I began the usual routine, carefully arranging gifts around the tree and nibbling on a cookie to make it look like Santa had come. Once that was done, I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Morning came, and my wife woke our son. He dashed downstairs, yelling in excitement, "Santa came!" He tore through the wrapped presents like a whirlwind. Watching him was the best part of the day, even though it passed too quickly. After about an hour, he was busy playing with his new toys while my wife and I began cleaning up the mess. That's when I noticed something strange. The cookie plate was empty. I distinctly remembered taking only one bite the night before, but now all the cookies were gone. At first, I assumed my wife must have eaten them, but when I asked, she laughed it off, teasing that maybe I'd been hungrier than I realized. Her smile faded when she saw I wasn't joking. I casually asked our son if he'd snuck any cookies, but his answer made my stomach drop. He said he hadn't touched them, but that he had seen Santa eating them. Trying to keep calm, I laughed it off, but inside, I was panicking. He explained that he'd woken up in the night and saw a man by the table eating the cookies. My wife, now visibly unsettled, whispered that it was probably just a dream, but the fear in her eyes told me she wasn't sure. I tried to convince myself it was just the imagination of a child, but the thought that someone might have actually been in our home that night sent a chill down my spine. I excused myself to check the upstairs rooms, even though I knew no one could still be hiding there. After double-checking the main floor, I went to the one place I dreaded, the basement. I hadn't been down there in months. It was a dark, unfinished space we'd stopped using after we moved the laundry upstairs. Now it was just a dusty storage room. I hesitated for a few seconds before opening the door and flicking on the light. The bulb barely illuminated the stairs, leaving the rest of the space in shadows. I held my breath, hoping I wouldn't hear or see anything. The floor creaked beneath my weight as I descended slowly, step by step. At first, everything seemed normal. Dusty boxes stacked against the walls, untouched since the last time we used the basement. But then I noticed something strange. A section of boxes seemed to be arranged deliberately like a barricade. It reminded me of forts I used to build as a kid, stacking things to create walls. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, every instinct telling me to turn back. Then I heard it, breathing, heavy and labored, coming from behind the stack of boxes. My heart stopped and I froze, praying whoever was there wouldn't see me. But slowly, a gaunt, filthy man emerged from behind the boxes. His sunken eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, he lunged, climbing over the boxes with surprising speed. I bolted up the stairs, adrenaline rushing through me as I heard his footsteps pounding behind me. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as his hand reached for the handle. Grabbing a chair, I jammed it under the doorknob to reinforce the lock. My wife screamed from the living room, clutching our son tightly. "Go upstairs!" I shouted, and she didn't hesitate, rushing to protect him as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the operator to pick up, a strange thought crossed my mind. I felt guilty for ruining someone's Christmas morning, though I knew it was a ridiculous thought. My family's safety was all that mattered now. The man banged on the door a few times before switching tactics. "Let me go. I didn't mean any harm," he shouted, his voice cracking. Then, as though arguing with someone invisible, he began muttering to himself in garbled, frantic words. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to understand what he was saying, but it only made my skin crawl. There was something deeply unhinged about him. For a second, I almost sympathized with him. Almost. When the police arrived, everything ended quickly. They dragged him out in cuffs while I explained what had happened. He didn't resist, just muttering under his breath as they led him away. The officer told me the man had likely been living in our basement for at least a week, maybe longer. He had been sneaking food and drinks from our kitchen while we were asleep or out. That revelation made me feel sick. Small things I had brushed off came rushing back. Missing snacks, a soda I didn't remember drinking. I had always blamed my wife or son for forgetting things, never imagining something so sinister. Even now, the image of that man's wild, desperate eyes lingers in my mind, and every time something small goes missing, a knot forms in my stomach, wondering if someone is lurking just out of sight, waiting for their chance. It was Christmas Day, a time traditionally meant for family, celebration, and joy in our small village of Nyabira. We had planned to attend church, share a meal, and commemorate the birth of Jesus. However, what was meant to be a day of peace became one that would forever haunt us, a day that tore apart everything we knew. I had risen early to help my mother prepare cassava and beans for the Christmas feast. My younger brother Kizo, who had just turned 8, was outside kicking his new football with our father. He was thrilled with the gift, not just because of the ball, but because he could finally play with his friends. Our father joked that one day Kizo would play professionally, travel to Europe, and make a lot of money. We all laughed, and for a fleeting moment, the future seemed full of possibilities. But we had no idea that terror was about to strike. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble, like thunder on a clear, blue sky. We thought it was just the wind or perhaps herding cattle. But then the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed through the air, and we knew something was terribly wrong. The attackers had arrived. They stormed into the village like a pack of wild animals, their eyes filled with rage. There were at least 20 or 30 of them, armed with guns, machetes, and clubs, some with nails hammered into them. They wore war paint, their faces twisted in a way that made them look less than human. As they ran through the village, they shouted words in a language I didn't understand, but their meaning was clear: violence, destruction, and death. We tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The village was surrounded by dense forest, and the attackers were moving fast. I grabbed Kizo's hand and pulled him toward the church, hoping it would offer refuge. But when we reached the steps, we saw the lifeless bodies of men, women, and children scattered across the ground. The attackers had shown no mercy. I froze, my grip tightening on Kizo's hand. He didn't understand what was happening, asking me in confusion, "Sister, what's going on?" I wanted to shield him, but I had no words to explain the horror unfolding before us. Then I watched as one of the attackers cornered my uncle. He stepped forward, hands raised, pleading for his life. But, without hesitation, the attacker shot him. The rebels laughed as he fell, and the sound of their laughter still echoes in my mind. The attackers rounded up those of us who were still alive and forced us to kneel in the dirt. One of them, their leader, shouted something, and they began to separate us. Men from women, adults from children. My father was among the men. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with fear and love, before they took him away, and I never saw him again. The women and children were taken to the church, but it quickly became a scene of horror. The attackers set the building on fire, forcing us to watch as the flames consumed everything. Those who tried to escape were either struck down with machetes or shot. I held Kizo tightly, trying to protect him, but how could I? One of the rebels noticed us, grabbed Kizo by the arm, and pulled him away. I screamed, begged, and pleaded, but he hit me hard with the butt of his rifle, and my vision went dark. I watched helplessly as Kizo was dragged away, his cries fading as I lost consciousness. Somehow, I survived. Perhaps the rebels thought I was dead, or perhaps it was some mercy from above. When I regained consciousness, the village was eerily silent, the only sound the crackling of the flames and the occasional moan of a wounded survivor. The attackers were gone, leaving behind a trail of destruction. I wandered through the village, calling for Kizo, for my mother, for anyone, but there was only silence and death. The church had been reduced to rubble, its charred remains a grim reminder of the devastation. Bodies were scattered everywhere, some unrecognizable from the violence they had endured. And there, among the dead, I found my mother, her eyes staring at the sky. I collapsed beside her, crying, but Kizo was nowhere to be found. I searched for days, through the forests and nearby villages, but there was no sign of him. I can only hope that he is still alive, though deep down, I fear the worst. The attackers were known to abduct children, either enslaving them or forcing them into their ranks, which for many was a fate worse than death. Years have passed since that Christmas, but the wounds are still fresh. I see the faces of the fallen in my dreams, the smell of smoke, the heat of the flames, the sounds of screams, all haunt me. I wonder why the world ignored our suffering. Why were we left to endure such horrors alone? The terror in our region hasn't ended, and as time passes, fewer people speak of what happened to us, as if it's no longer a story worth telling. But I share this not for pity, but so that the world will remember. I want people to remember those we lost, the lives torn apart, and the children who may still be out there, lost to the horrors of war. I seek justice and peace for my village, for my family, for Kizo, and for the generations that will follow. It was Christmas Eve, and I was alone in my apartment, preparing for the holiday the best way I knew how, by watching old Christmas movies and sipping hot chocolate. My family lived across the country, and my shift at work had kept me from traveling. It was a quiet evening, the kind that feels almost magical, except that this year felt a little off. The apartment complex was practically empty. Most people had gone home for the holidays, and the building was eerily silent. I had just finished decorating the tiny Christmas tree I'd set up earlier in the week, and was heading to bed when I heard a soft knock at my door. Confused, I glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. No one should have been knocking at this hour, especially on Christmas Eve. I hesitated, then moved cautiously toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the hallway, but something about them seemed wrong. They wore a heavy, tattered winter coat and had a hood pulled low over their face, obscuring their features. They didn't seem to move, just stood there, perfectly still. I didn't recognize them. My heart started racing. I thought about ignoring it, but then the knocking came again, louder this time. There was no way I could simply ignore it. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "Santa," the voice on the other side rasped. I was taken aback. What kind of joke was this? At first, I figured maybe it was some drunk guy playing a prank, but then I thought, no one in the building would be out this late. Everyone else had left. I needed to make sure it wasn't some dangerous person pretending to be Santa. I backed away from the door and quickly grabbed my phone. I called the building's security, but it rang out. I called again. Nothing. My mind raced. Was someone trying to rob me? Should I call the police? I took a deep breath and crept back to the peephole. The figure was gone. I exhaled, relieved, but then the doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the empty hallway. I froze. I didn't dare move closer to the door. There was a sudden rustling sound and a muffled voice from the hallway. "Please, let me in." I'm cold. I debated my next move, the fear of uncertainty growing stronger. I checked the hallway again through the peephole. It was empty. Nothing. The darkened corridor stretched beyond the frame, as quiet and vacant as before. I sat there, staring at the door, my mind racing. I was going to have to call the police. Just as I reached for my phone, I heard a soft, scraping sound against the door. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away. I waited for what felt like forever before I dared to unlock the door and peek outside. The hallway was completely silent, no trace of anyone. It was as if the stranger had never been there at all. I stepped back, my nerves rattled, and closed the door with a trembling hand, double locking it for good measure. The rest of the night passed without incident. But in the morning, I discovered something chilling. There, on the doorstep, was a single Christmas card, placed carefully on the mat. I picked it up and turned it over. It was a photo of Santa. An old vintage photo, but something about the eyes in the picture sent a chill through me. They seemed too real, too knowing. In the corner of the card, someone had scribbled in fading ink, "See you next year." When I was 19, I had a part-time job working at the local movie theater in my small town. I didn't mind the job, it was fairly easy, and the atmosphere was relaxed most of the time. On Christmas Eve, I was scheduled to work the night shift. The movie theater would usually stay open during the holidays, even though the town was small and the crowds were always minimal. Christmas Eve, in particular, was always quiet. I never quite understood why they didn't close early, but it meant the shift wasn't too bad. There weren't many customers, and you could get away with just sitting behind the counter, checking your phone, and doing some light cleaning when needed. I was scheduled for an 8-hour shift that night. The theatre closed around 1 a.m., and for the second half of my shift, I would be working alone. This wasn't unusual. As the closing staff member, I'd be the one to lock up the theatre at the end of the night. I'd done it plenty of times, and it had always been a fairly routine task. The night started off just like any other. We had a few people trickle in, maybe a handful of customers for the last show of the evening, but the theatre was almost empty. The biggest event of the night was the delivery of the popcorn machine's maintenance check. Nothing too exciting. By about 10 p.m., there were only a couple of cars left in the parking lot, one of which was mine. From my station behind the counter, I could see outside through the large windows. That's when I noticed a car parked near the back end of the lot. Its headlights were on, and it was facing the building, but the car wasn't moving. At first, I thought it was just another person waiting for the movie to start. Some people would get there early to avoid the ads that played before the movie started. It was a little strange though, because the car hadn't moved in a while and the lot was emptying out. As the time ticked by and the movie ended for the last few customers, I realized the car was still there, its lights shining into the theater, illuminating the space around it. By the time I was preparing to close up, the lot was almost completely empty. The car near the back was still running, and the parking lot only had 2 remaining cars, mine and the one with the headlights still on. I had hoped the car would leave, but it didn't. I locked the doors to the theater, went through my usual routine of turning off the lights, and began to finish up for the night. It was getting close to 1 a.m., and I wanted to be quick about finishing up so I could leave. I figured I'd get the closing tasks done, and the sooner I finished, the sooner I could go home. I stepped outside, locking the front doors behind me, but as I turned back around, something made me stop. The car's headlights were still on, but now 3 of the car's doors opened in quick succession. 3 men got out of the car and started walking toward the building at a fast pace. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but something didn't feel right. They weren't just walking to the theater door like normal customers. Their gait was urgent, and they were too focused on me. Panic set in, and I instinctively turned and sprinted back toward my car. I didn't even think twice about trying to be discreet. I just ran as fast as I could. To my horror, the men immediately started running after me. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me. My car was only a few yards away, but it felt like it was miles away. I finally reached the door, scrambled inside, and locked it behind me, all while my adrenaline was racing. I started the engine as quickly as I could and began to reverse out of the parking lot. But as I shifted into drive and started pulling out of the lot, I noticed something chilling in my rearview mirror. The car with the men was now following me. They were close, tailing me with their headlights on, just a few feet behind. My mind went into overdrive, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't know if they were just playing some sort of sick game or if they were actually trying to harm me. The thought of them following me home made my stomach turn. I couldn't let them know where I lived. In sheer panic, I called my dad. I explained what was happening, and he immediately told me to head toward the nearest police station. I could barely think straight, but I knew he was right. I had to get help. My hands were shaking as I drove, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road in front of me. The car was still there, right on my tail. The drive felt like it took forever, and every time I looked in the mirror, I saw that car not giving up. They followed me the entire way, close enough that I could almost make out their license plate. I was getting close to the police station when I finally saw the lights ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a brief glimmer of hope. But then, just as I was pulling into the parking lot, the car sped past me, ignoring the entrance altogether. I was frozen for a moment, watching as they sped away into the distance. I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still trembling, and I could feel my legs starting to weaken from the adrenaline. I waited until I saw my dad pull up behind me and walked over to him, still shaking. We went inside the police station, and I gave my statement. The officers took the situation seriously, but they didn't have much to go on. The car had vanished once it passed me, and the men hadn't done anything overtly threatening, at least not until they started chasing me. It was clear they weren't just normal moviegoers, but beyond that I had no idea what they had planned. Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode